All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie. I run marketing for Moonbeam, and today we also have Derek, the founder of Moonbeam, and he's here to speak to connected contracts. So for those of you who follow Moonbeam on Twitter, you've probably seen us use this term probably for the last couple of weeks, and it refers to some of the technology that we're working on, some of the changes that we're implementing that are really pretty important, not just to what you see on Moonbeam today, but of course what's coming in terms of future deployments. And so in order to explain that and to kind of give it some more color, Derek will be kind of sharing his view and some of the use cases that we've already seen start to emerge. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that before we dive in, Derek.
No, this is I've been thinking a lot about these connected contracts like use cases. So this is I'm happy to speak about this. I think I can go on for hours on some of these use cases and different ideas and how I think things are going to evolve. So this is right up my alley. I really like this topic.
Cool. Well, let's start with the basics. What is a connected contract, and what is the vision for Moonbeam as it pertains to connected contracts?
Yeah, so I would I'll give a little context. I'll take one step back first, which is kind of why it is that we created in the what's going to happen, and how those ideas from now several years ago, a couple of years ago, are actually happening now. So it is pretty exciting. So the concept was always this, that the idea was that there's going to be many blockchains. And right now there's some number of them. It's growing, but my vision is that in the future there's going to be many of these things. And as soon as you accept that idea, then the immediate next question is, how do these things work together? How do they talk to each other? How do you do something useful like across like more than one of these things? They're not that useful if they're all islands onto themselves. And so that was kind of the original thought that led us down the path of creating, the Moonbeam as technology is, if we just imagine a world where there's just many, many blockchains and there's a need for them to all communicate with each other, what might an interesting, what's an interesting spot to occupy, like given those assumptions? And yeah, and that's really where Moonbeam came from. And so the idea is that Moonbeam is an L1 smart contract platform that is specifically built to support cross-chain use cases. And so this is really where the connected contracts idea comes in, is that a smart contract on Moonbeam uh, can work with things that are local to it. So it can work with users and tokens and other things that are local on Moonbeam, but it can also work with tokens, serve users and access functionality that's on other blockchains. And so that's really the key kind of different idea, where traditional smart contracts are kind of confined or only like work within the context of one blockchain, but smart contracts on Moonbeam, connected contracts, can access and work with tokens, serve users, access functionality from many different blockchains. And that it's a simple like idea, but it has like really profound like implications as to how the developers are going to build things, like what apps in the future are going to look like, what even what blockchains are going to look like. These new blockchains are going to be created, like what they look like. I think it has like a number of like profound like implications for that.
So when we talk about smart contracts being able to access functionality on multiple blockchains, how is that different from what we see right now in terms of multi-chain approaches or interoperability? Um, the terms kind of get thrown around interchangeably, but when we look around today, how does this connected contract approach really differ from that?
Yeah, I would say that the big, so I mean this is, there are many blockchains now, right? So there's not just one. And so even in the the current day to day with its blockchains, there is this kind of market desire to connect or move between chains, and that has largely been served to date like with bridges. right? So the use case is I have tokens on one chain, I want to move those tokens to another chain. And so that's really been the key interoperability driver to date, has been the rise of these bridges, and there's all different kind of bridging approaches. There's different technical designs, there's different user experiences, but in the end, it's been centered around this idea of I have tokens on one chain. How do I move them to another chain? And so I'd say that's largely what interop has looked like to date. Is really focused on these third-party protocols that provide a bridging capability that users then interact with to move tokens like from one chain to another. I see that as like a very kind of narrow and specific use case of like a much broader question of how is it that these different blockchains can interact with each other. It's just focused only on tokens and only on users interacting directly with these things to move tokens. But interoperability is a much broader concept, which could involve, for example, like calling functionality on a remote chain, using something. Let's say you have a chain that specializes store data on it and then retrieve that data. Like a functional data. So yeah, if I summarize kind of what things look like today, it's the approach is either you kind of have a deployment of an application on one chain, and then you ask users, you say, hey, like there's these different bridges, use those to kind of move tokens to deposit or kind of use with my application. That's one approach. Or you have this approach, I've called it in the past like multi-instance. And so the idea around multi-instance is, hey, I developed a software like an EVM, a Solidity based like smart contract and dApp. And so let me just deploy that same dApp to many chains. So I'll deploy that to Ethereum and Moonbeam and BSC and Polygon. And so that's another approach that's out there. That approach has challenges too, though. Like that leads to this kind of fragmentation, like of a bunch of different things: user experience, liquidity if it's a DeFi application, functionality. It's often like not the same functionality on each chain. So those are some of the existing approaches that are out there.
Great. Let's switch gears a little bit here. So when we're talking about connected contracts, what is it that's enabling this technology that either didn't exist before or is new or is kind of, cobbled together in an interesting way? Like what's enabling all of this kind of advancement on Moonbeam?
Yeah. So I think the key enabling technology that, by the way, is quite new, right? So these technologies are largely things that have come into being this year. There's a couple examples that are before this year, but really like the bulk of them are this year. And that capability is this ability to send messages between blockchains, from one smart contract to another. That is something that is basically a new capability. People have like different names for this. I tend to use the terminology a general message passing capability, but the idea is that you have some means of, from one smart contract, you can basically call out to, let's say, another smart contract on another chain. And so this ability to send messages between different blockchains, that's like the key primitive that didn't exist before and that now exists. And there's a bunch of different, let's call them transports, right? So there's different, competing, protocols now, different technologies, different approaches in how to achieve this. But that the kind of underlying idea is the same, that there's like basically this generic messaging capability that developers can use to connect like their smart contracts on different chains, or their logic on different chains together. And that's something that's new, right? As I said, in kind of the current state, or what's happened in the past, is generally unconnected contracts, right? So you have just different deployments on different chains. They don't know about each other. And then users maybe pick. They're like, okay, well, I'm in the front end. I'm going to pick to go to Moonbeam. I'm going to pick to go to Ethereum mainnet. And then the user's kind of deciding like which chain to go to, and then that you get this kind of chain-specific experience. That's different than this idea where you can have messages that connect the smart contracts on different chains together.
So how is that different than what we already have from an XCM perspective?
Well, so I put so just for context, right? XCM is the messaging technology that is part of the Polkadot ecosystem. That's in fact one of the unique messaging transports that Moonbeam has access to because Moonbeam lives, as a parachain on Polkadot. That means that it gets some very important security services like from Polkadot, but it also means that it can send and receive XCM messages with a very, very high degree of security because the security of XCM messages is like built into the chain itself. And so I'd say that XCM is simply one of multiple different messaging transports that's available now. And so we're in a state right now where there are many of these things, right? XCM is one. Many people may have heard of IBC is one that's used in the Cosmos ecosystem that shares at least some similarities with XCM. But then there's a number of other protocols. So protocols like Axelar, Layer 0. There's a number of protocols that provide messaging capabilities connecting different chains together. And so I think that the concept, or where we are right now, is that there's multiple competing messaging systems, and it's unclear which ones are going to dominate like which use cases. And so the Moonbeam idea is we want to support and integrate as many of these as possible, to give developers optionality and choices of which messaging systems make sense for their particular use case.
So we've got basically a number of these systems, right? Like I know the two that you called out were Axelar and Layer 0, amongst many other messaging systems, at least for remote blockchains. And then of course within Polkadot they have kind of this built-in system called XCM. And so when you look at those two things, what's the advantage to building on Moonbeam versus any other smart contract platform?
Yeah, I think that since Moonbeam is really focused on supporting these use cases, that means I already said that means that there's a bunch of different messaging transports have been integrated, but it also comes down to the tooling. On the Moonbeam side, for example, there's been part of the product strategy of Moonbeam has been to implement this EVM compatible environment in Substrate. Substrate's the development framework that we've used to implement Moonbeam, and so having the right set of tools to actually be productive as a developer, that's one thing, but also taking an approach where you can be compatible with those tools, but also access this new cross-chain functionality. So that's something that is unique to Moonbeam, that we've kind of both made an environment that's EVM compatible, but also has access to these cross-chain functions. In particular, through the use of precompiles, which are these kind of special built-in things that look like smart contracts, in the Moonbeam EVM. So there's a bunch of those that are unique to Moonbeam that extend, let's say, the base functionality you have as a developer in an EVM with specific cross-chain functionality. And so, I think that being focused on this, and also there's new tools are being created, right? So you need almost new tools when you go into this cross-chain world, because most tools, just like the dApps I was describing, are focused on one chain at a time kind of visibility or action, whereas in this new world now there's starting to be multi-chain interactions, right? You may have scenarios that cut across different chains. So take something as simple as an explorer, right? So for an explorer, you may need the ability to trace a transaction across chains. So there's definitely tooling that is needed that is specific to these cross-chain use cases, and that's where folks like the Moonbeam Foundation are supporting with grants a number of teams that are building these kinds of cross-chain tools.
So for teams that are bought into this cross-chain concept, what kind of considerations do they need to make when they're evaluating Moonbeam or another smart contract platform? What are the things they're looking for typically?
I mean, I still feel that we're at the very beginning of this big shift in how dApps are developed, to shift from this mindset of I'm going to deploy to one, copies of this application to one chain at a time, to a mental model where it's I'm going to have one application that simultaneously lives on all of these chains, but acts as one system. And it makes sense when you talk about it like that, but it's still, this is a big kind of shift in mental model, right? So I still find that a lot of teams have this mindset of, okay, like I need to pick a chain, right? I have to pick like a single chain, and that's this kind of huge decision that you have to make up front. It's like, if I pick right, it's good. If I pick wrong, it's bad. And they're kind of hung on this like question. I think that as these ideas just spread, and by the way, there's going to be key drivers for why these cross-chain connected, kind of implementation directions are going to get traction. It's because the apps that are created are better, so they're both more efficient, and they're like have like significant usability improvements over the approaches before. So that's what's gonna drive like the adoption of these things. But I still think it's around this like developer education and mental models, right? You have to get over this model of, hey, software only goes onto one chain. That's still the mental model a lot of people are operating under. And yeah, I think so. It's kind of a shift in thinking that needs to happen, where developers need to really understand that that style of thinking of, hey, I need to go to one chain. I need to bring assets like to be co-located with the logic I create. That's like the old style of thinking. In the new style, it's like my app can be everywhere. I can serve users like locally. I can have kind of like local branches of my app that serve users wherever they are, and you don't need to move these tokens like to be next to like where the app is, because the app is kind of everywhere, right? So users just interact locally with some branch office or kind of some arm of like the app, but they're all these branches are kind of connected together. So that's the key idea. I think that is gaining traction now, but it's the stuff is quite new. So I think it always just takes a while for these ideas to kind of develop, and you need people see examples of successful protocols, and then one follows the other, and there's kind of a process that happens.
So this can be a little bit abstract. So with that in mind, are there examples or kind of use cases that you can walk through that help illustrate the kind of difference that we would see with a cross-chain connected application versus one that is maybe, this multi-instance style that you referred to?
Yeah. I mean, I'll use an example that I think illustrates it well. So that's this example of a team building something called Prime Protocol. And so this is a DeFi application. It's a stable coin so it's kind of in this like lending and borrowing space, where think of something that at least shares some similarities to something like Maker, right? So you kind of deposit collateral into the protocol that gives you the right to mint stable coins like out, right? That's kind of the mental model. Now, so take Maker. So Maker is a good example where it's an existing protocol. It's been around for a long time. It lives on Ethereum mainnet, and even DAI is like on other chains, right? But the idea is, if you want to interact with it, you go to Ethereum mainnet, right? So if you have assets you want to use as collateral, you have to bridge them like to Ethereum mainnet. All the action happens on Ethereum mainnet, and then maybe DAI can then move back out like somewhere else. But it's the use of these bridges. There's a one deployment location, and then maybe users are expected to use these bridges to move the assets around, either to the protocol or like away from the protocol once you've minted things. That's like the old idea. So what does the new idea look like? So if you take the architecture of this like Prime protocol, they have the idea of having, it's kind of a hub and spoke model. So they have a planned hub like on Moonbeam. So that would be a kind of a master set of like smart contracts that serve as the hub of their system. But then at the same time, they have satellite like smart contract deployments on a bunch of chains. So Ethereum mainnet, like Polygon, VM chains. And so the idea, all of these smart contracts on these different maker or in a protocol like that, where it's kind of confined to one chain. In this case, users can do like asset in the local branch, if you want to call it that, on whatever chain they're on. So if you're on Avalanche, you can deposit like collateral into the local Prime kind of branch office like on Avalanche. And then what happens is these cross-chain messages are used to record that, right? So all of these satellite like smart contracts are connected back to the hub via these cross-chain messages. So when a user performs a deposit like that, that the fact that the deposit has happened gets sent back to the hub and is recorded there. So you have this kind of master database, let's call it, that is recording all of the deposits in the system. Hey, this user made this deposit on Avalanche. And so now that you have this like central database, like that thing has cross-chain visibility into like all of the state of the system. So then that same user can go somewhere else. Let's say they go to Ethereum mainnet. They can say, hey, I want to mint stablecoins now. And so then, the smart contract on mainnet will consult back with the hub and say, hey, this user wants to do this. And then the hub might say, yeah, here's the credit they have in their account. They made these deposits on Avalanche. And then, that user will be able to mint stablecoins against the collateral that they put in on Avalanche. And so it's just a quite different model, this model where all these things are connected together, where you can kind of have this system that is acting as one system. Compare that to the idea of having, let's say, multiple makers, right? You might have a maker deployment on mainnet. You might have a maker deployment on Avalanche. You might have, this protocol deployed in many places. But, if you do that, none of those deployments know about each other. So, if a user deposited on Avalanche, then they could mint on Avalanche, but those deposits aren't useful anywhere else. In the model I described, the prime staking, anything you do on any one chain is relevant and usable on any other chain. And so that goes to this kind of idea of efficiency. Like it's like much, much more efficient to do that. As a DeFi protocol, you can kind of sum the TVL across all your deployments, and they're all effectively usable, versus only being usable, on whatever particular chain it happens to be on. So that's like I'd say that's one illustration of the power of this idea of connected contracts.
So you were breaking up a little bit for part of that, so I just want to make sure we're reading the core point. And so with protocol, you basically described what today would be many transactions, right? You would be interacting with Prime on Polygon and Moonbeam and all these other instances separately, and they would be kind of separate transactions. And instead, with this new world, through Prime, through connected contracts on Moonbeam, a user is able to kind of interact with one interface, and these things happen behind the scenes, but it's not necessarily kind of all of these individual transactions. It's a much more integrated experience. Is that a fair recap?
Yeah, no, but I'd say yes, but I'd say that I think the point I was driving at with this example was one of efficiency, right? So that from the protocol's perspective, being able to use um, the deposits on any chain, that's like a big like competitive advantage, right? That's a big advantage over a scenario where, you're deployed on many chains, but you're kind of only, if you deposit on one chain, you can only use those deposits on that chain, right? That's different than a world where you can deposit on chain A and then use that deposit on chain B. That's like a much more flexible and much more efficient setup. And so my belief is that that even just that idea alone, like that's going to change the way DeFi works. I mean, there's like if people are going to create cross-chain connected versions of almost everything that that is around now. That's part of what I'd call kind of DeFi 1.0, right? Lending and borrowing protocols, DEXs, and you start to see some of this happening already, right? That I think it's also Sushi announced like their cross-chain capabilities. So a lot. You'll start to see protocols employ this approach because they can have more efficiency, right? So which means that they're going to be able to compete like more effectively with protocols that don't take this approach.
You mentioned a couple kind of key projects there. Are there any other examples of either current or upcoming projects that you can share, where they're already working on these sorts of connected use cases?
Sure. I mean, there are some that are in production like right now on Moonbeam. So just to talk about that, I'll talk about one briefly, which is the Lido deployment on Moonbeam. So folks are probably familiar with Lido. They're the largest protocol when it comes to liquid staking derivatives. They have, by far and away the largest market share of liquid staking derivatives on Ethereum with their STETH product. And so they, when they look to create a liquid staking derivative for DOT in the Polkadot ecosystem, this is where they engaged with Moonbeam. And the way that the development or kind of the way the protocol works on Moonbeam is that you have a set of connected smart contracts on Moonbeam that implement the logic for the liquid staking protocol, the Lido liquid staking protocol. But the connected contracts then kind of reach out and perform staking actions on the Polkadot relay chain, which is a different chain, right? So Moonbeam is a chain, and the Polkadot relay chain is a different chain, and that's where Dot lives. And so by using connected contracts in this case, you kind of have the power of two different blockchains, right? You have Moonbeam providing this EVM environment. You have Polkadot itself, which has a bunch of functions like governance functions, staking functions that are very specialized. And you're kind of combining functionality from both those chains together to create like one user experience back. So that's in production today. If you go to moonbeam.lido.fi and you can use that today. I'll give another example that maybe illustrates a different point. That is what I would call the other really key benefit of connected contracts is this integration happening with osmosis. So osmosis, for folks that aren't aware, is an app chain DEX in the Cosmos ecosystem. So it is like a full chain itself, implemented using the Cosmos SDK, implements a DEX that has a number of kind of unique and interesting features. It's gotten some significant traction. And one of the key principles that they're always going after is to improve the user experience. And so one of the things that the team at Osmosis wanted to do is to support Dot, right? So to support Dot natively, right? So that a user could basically deposit like a Dot into Osmosis, but do that like directly to a Dot address. So how does that work? So in Osmosis, they can present this like Dot deposit address to users. That's on the Polkadot relay chain. And when users make a Dot deposit to that address, there's a whole string of kind of actions that get kicked off, right? So, that's detected that there's a deposit into that deposit address on, that Polkadot deposit address. It gets, that Dot gets forwarded then to Moonbeam as what we call XC-Dot. So that's, an XCM, this cross-chain messaging system XCM is used to kind of move the Dot like over to Moonbeam. Then it's forwarded to Axelar, which is one of the other cross-chain messaging systems that we spoke about earlier in the spaces here. That gets routed over to the Cosmos ecosystem, and then IBC is used to connect into Osmosis and to kind of move the Dot over to Osmosis, and then an LP action is triggered to, let's say, if they want to deposit into one of the pools on Osmosis. And so it's a bit, it's many steps that I was just describing of all this path this asset is taking. But I think this is a good illustration of the power of connected contracts, where there's all these different pieces of infrastructure and systems that are being used to power the scenario. But think about the user. The user, all they see is they got a Dot deposit address. They put Dot into it, and then the effect happens of this LP action into the Osmosis pool. And behind the scenes, hidden away from the user, are all these 7-8 steps that are happening behind the scenes. And so I think this is a big unlock for connected contracts, is that you can do this. You can kind of hide away this infrastructural complexity of manually using bridges, or to do all those steps I described manually would be a lot of different clicking and a lot of different actions and a lot of knowledge needed. But here you've kind of hidden that complexity away from the user. So then you have that's a big win. Basically, you're able to offer this much better user experience. And so that's going to be another key driver for this connected contracts approach, is that teams that adopt this will be able to offer better user experiences than people that don't.
So where do we go from here, right? We have a number of projects in the works already. How does that impact what the next 6, 12, 18 months look like for Moonbeam, but for the broader ecosystem as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my expectation, and it's already happening now, is that there is this big shift happening in the way apps are developed to incorporate these ideas. It always takes a little bit of time from when a new technology is kind of available and in production to when you start to see protocols kind of deploying with it as exemplars or kind of examples of how this can be used to be in this case more efficient and provide a better user experience. And so that's happening now. There are, as I mentioned, there's already some protocols that are deployed already. There's a bunch that are in flight. The teams that are building using this approach and using these different cross-chain connected techniques, they're in flight now that expect that we'll be deploying in the next within the next 6 months, let's say. And so this is kind of what I see is that this first wave of apps is kind of in flight now. And based upon the success of those apps, you'll start to see like many more, followers as different people take these ideas and apply it into like different domains. A lot of the traction I see right now is in the DeFi like sector, but I'm seeing traction in like kind of the gaming and as well, right? People are adopting these techniques to make these kind of available on every chain. These are different areas where these ideas apply. And so I think that it's time, right? There's a lot of things, rules have to change. The first one is in flight now, and my expectation is over the next, let's call it like, 24 months, there's going to be significant adoption of this approach. And I'm actually of the belief that protocols that don't take this approach are going to be at a significant disadvantage over time. So you'll almost like have to adopt this approach to be competitive. Otherwise, you may get left behind. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some protocols that are very like large and successful right now. You know how it is, right? It's like if you're big and successful, it's always challenging to adapt to new technologies that are coming out. So there may be kind of current winners that become losers, and then new protocols that are based on this connected contracts approach will become kind of the new winners of the next wave. That's the future that I see.
So you had briefly mentioned this, but I just want to jump back to this idea quickly as well. So you mentioned that this is going to have a pretty dramatic impact on the user experience. Can you add a little bit more color about what exactly is going to change there and how kind of dramatic this shift will be?
Yeah, I think the theme is around. Let me start with the challenge, right? So like one of the biggest challenges I see right now in adoption of Web3 dApps is like the amount of complexity and knowledge the end users are expected to understand, and the knowledge expected to have in order to successfully interact like with the dApp or the application. And if you look at non Web3 apps, just regular Web 1 or Web 2 apps, um, they follow this similar pattern where they're required a lot of knowledge like in the beginning, but over time the need for specialized kind of technical knowledge or knowledge about how like infrastructure works diminished like over time, right? Really there was this focus on user experience ultimately, that winning apps like were the ones that offered the best user experience. So I see exactly the same path for Web3 applications. And so we're in a state right now where to use a given application, I mean, there are certain things that are going to be baseline. So having your own wallet and seed phrase and all of this. I mean, I think that's part of. And there are technologies even that are addressing that, but let's just say that that's kind of a baseline. But think about all of the bridging infrastructure that people like need to understand now. It's like complicated to use these things, right? And so my expectation is that these cross-chain connected dApps will really start to hide away a lot of this complexity away from the user, right? And reduce the amount of knowledge that the end users need to have and the amount of steps that they need to take in order to achieve the result that they want. And so, yeah, even something as simple as the idea I had before of, or was explaining before of, just allowing, let's say, even deposits, like something as simple as that, like allow a user to deposit like an asset from wherever they have it, not bridge it first, not interact with some third-party software, but just in the app itself, just accept deposits from like any chain, like just using the native asset. That's like a real simple use case, but think about how much easier that is than making people understand some kind of bridge, make them like use it, like make them do all of these extra steps versus just in the app itself, so natively supporting like deposits on of like native assets. So I think there's a lot of things like that where this cross-chain messaging approach can be used to reduce the number of steps and reduce the knowledge and that is needed by the end users, and that's going to have like a a big positive effect on adoption, on volume and traction for a lot of dApps.
Great. So last question here. When we're looking at this cross-chain connected contracts approach from a Moonbeam perspective, I don't think a lot of teams are really looking at things this way. I still see a lot of layer ones focused on sort of this multi-instance approach of getting an application deployed to their network and not really focusing on building an environment where developers can really build kind of more robust connected applications. And so, one, is that a fair characterization? Are you seeing that too? And then, two, are there any other teams that are approaching this problem in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I have a number of different thoughts, some of them a bit philosophical, but I would say that that's largely correct on your first point about L1s. And I think, the L1s themselves are kind of subject to this like old style of thinking that I was talking about, right? So if you're like an existing kind of L1 that's been in production for some time, I think you think of the world as this kind of zero-sum game, right? You're like, okay, there's some set of developers, they're going to choose to deploy their app somewhere to some, the assumption being a particular place. And so we're in a fight with everyone else to just get those developers, right? And when we get those developers, we want like, there's like some finite amount of like transactions that are like out there. And we just want as many of those transactions to be on our chain, right? To fill our block space and have create demand for our block space. And that, that makes us more valuable, right? So that's I think the default mindset that a lot of L1s have is this zero sum game. We want to just acquire as many of the development teams and as much of the transaction volume as possible. If you think about this cross-chain connected idea, it kind of runs at odds at this, right? Because you're saying, okay, it's almost like acknowledging that a given team and the dApp they're deploying isn't going to be just on my chain; it's going to be on multiple chains. And so I think already that's like a philosophical difference, but I see that change as inevitable. So you might as well embrace it, right, and get ahead of it. Because the developers, when you talk to them, they don't necessarily want to be locked in on one chain, right? I mean, there's all these different discrete markets for users, and that have different like tokens in them and whatnot. And so from their perspective, they want to be able to access like all of these. And so I think that it's developer led in that sense. That this change is going to be developer led, despite what the L1s in question want. So yeah, I think that's that's definitely one thing I would say is that I mean my belief is actually that different kinds of metrics will come into play. So the vision for Moonbeam is not like, hey, we're going to like capture all the developers and transactions and these things. I mean, of course, we want those things to grow over time as a sign of as part of the development of the network. But really, I think for me, it's like the number of like messages being sent, right, and the amount of like cross-chain activity that's happening on Moonbeam. That's like a much better indicator for us and kind of the vision that we have. Because if Moonbeam could be kind of a messaging hub in this like connected world, that's like that's really like a great spot to be. And already we've seen a lot of that from just even being at this this kind of juncture where we have this these integrations with other EVM chains that are live on Moonbeam, but then we also have this connectivity via XEM to other parachains in the Polkadot ecosystem. Already that's an interesting kind of juncture or kind of spot to be in, and already that's leading to a bunch of different teams deploying different kinds of cross-chain scenarios that are kind of routing through Moonbeam because it's sitting at this kind of a railroad juncture, if you want to use that analogy. So yeah, I think that's some of the things, and I think actually as this change unfolds, that there will be different metrics that are important. So whereas right now I think there's a lot of focus on TVL as one example, right? But you realize in this cross-chain connected world, if you're not bridging assets, they don't need to move anywhere. So then this whole idea of measuring success as TVL, it's kind of this cross-chain connected approach kind of eats away at that, right? Because the assets aren't moving, right? They're just staying wherever they are. And so there isn't the same, at least from an L1 perspective, there's not the same, hey, I just want to like get as much TVL as possible, right? It's more about, powering these different like cross-chain like interactions and the amount of interactions that are being successfully kind of orchestrated or managed. That's probably a better sign of traction and success.
Excellent. Great. Well, so I do want to touch upon like for Moonbeam in many ways, this is sort of the next generation, right? This is what's upcoming. from a dApps perspective and what we see as really driving change in a fundamental way to not only make the user experience better for folks who are already in the ecosystem, but to also just improve it for any new people who might pile in the future, right? Who might join the Web3 space. And so this is really critical, I think, to what we've been working toward for the last certainly 8 months of Moonbeam being in production. With that in mind, we do have a number of resources linked to from this Twitter Spaces. So there's a thread with more information about connected contracts and a link to a page where you can kind of dive in a little bit deeper. Derek, you also mentioned a grants program run by the Moonbeam Foundation, where grants are available to teams that are interested in this kind of thing. We have tons of documentation on its way out the door as well, new blogs that are posted kind of continually. Are there other resources that folks can look to if they want to find out more about this approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always, of course, development teams that are looking to learn more about this approach. There's quite a bit of work that's gone into the technical documentation site, that is available at docs.moonbeam.network, including, I would say, a growing number of examples of how to use these cross-chain connected techniques using different messaging transports, so XCM, XLR, and others. So it's a great place to learn, and look at examples, and to use Moonbeam as a place to try things out. That makes us happy.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Derek. I'm sure we will have many more of these as we really start to unfold some of these use cases that you mentioned. But in the interim, appreciate obviously all of your insight and explanation here as we sort of kick off the real fun stuff from a connected contracts perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for joining.
Cool. All right. Thank you guys. We're going to end it now.